reporting on the Spanish-American War, as they both sent correspondents to Cuba. But it was these losses that resulted kind of like in a truce between the papers in 1898.
Sure.
And as I alluded to very inarticulately at the beginning of this podcast, the lasting term, I guess, that came out of this rivalry was known as yellow journalism, or essentially this new sensationalized form of reporting. Hearst would be forever linked with this style of journalism, and to this day, a lot of people could probably easily liken him to an early Rupert Murdoch.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, in truth, Hearst was actually a very shy man. He was just good at self-promotion and marketing.
Okay.
He was also a man of many contradictions. For example, he was an intense supporter of the Democratic Party, but later on, he was a major critic of the New Deal in the 1930s. He was also the friend of the common man, yet he lived a life of extravagance that eventually led to major amounts of debt. Now, in his personal life, he didn't really have much of one initially. Apparently, he was a bit of a prude, but he did.
It's kind of surprising.
Yeah, he did like the chorus girls, like our good friend Stanny. He was considered a stage door Johnny, which was a term for the men who kind of hung around backstage hoping to hook up with an actress. Now, when he was 34 years old, he began dating a 16-year-old chorus girl named Millicent Wilson.
Oh, no.
Now,
that wasn't my next thing. At least he didn't end up with a teenager. He did.
Yeah. So, there was actually evidence that Millicent's mother ran a brothel protected by Tammany Hall.
Oh, my.
Which is kind of interesting since he, had such disdain.
Right, for them. Yeah.
Now, despite her mother's dubious profession, William and Millicent's dates were chaperoned by her oldest sister, Anita. And they would date for 6 years.
That's a long time.
That is. And they finally wed in 1903 when Millicent was 21 and Hearst was 40. So apparently, Mama Hearst was not a happy camper because she thought Millicent was low class.
Yeah, well, she wasn't not low class.
Yeah. Now, William and Millicent Hearst would have 5 children, all boys. George Randolph was born in 1904. William Jr. was born in 1908. John Randolph was born in 1910, and finally, twins Randolph Apperson and David Whitmire were born in 1915. I have no clue why they deviated on that, using Randolph as the middle name, and then it's like they ran out of names, so...
I guess so.
Let's name...
Apperson was the mom.
The mom's maiden name, yeah.
Right.
I don't know where they got Whitmire from. That's kind of strange. Now, with the birth of so many grandchildren, Phoebe Hearst eventually came to accept Millicent.
I guess. Wow.
So Millicent was very close to all her sons, but like most women of her class, she was principally engaged in social events and philanthropy. Can't say that word.
Philanthropy.
Philanthropy. There we go. She was very involved with women's organizations during World War I. She actually became well known for establishing the Free Milk Fund for Babies in 1921. And this organization would provide free milk to the poor of New York City for many decades.
Oh.
Meanwhile, Hearst began to act on his political aspirations. He was actually elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1903, which was around the time that he married Millicent. He served one term in the House, and by all accounts, he was actually not very present in Washington, but in 1904, he was popular enough to be considered for the Democratic candidate for president.
Really?
Yeah. But he did not get enough votes, of course, for the nomination. So he went on to run for New York City mayor. He came close to winning, but ultimately lost by 3,000 votes. So using the momentum from his campaign, he ran for governor the following year, but lost because he flip-flopped and began supporting Tammany Hall. So I just wanted to call him a flip-flopper.
Yeah. That's an odd thing to flip-flop on.
Right.
I mean, that's to be opposed to the Tammany Hall machine, and then
didn't they kind of
say, "Hey, I like you now"?
Didn't they eventually sort of reform towards the end? I want to say that they did.
I thought so.
Yeah, so maybe that was what it was. But by 1909, he was pretty much done with politics when he suffered a major defeat in another mayoral election. So with his political aspirations dashed, I guess he figured he could resume his enjoyment of the theater And yes, I mean actresses.
What kind of theater? The
Broad.
women in the theater.
Yes, exactly. It was around 1918 that Hearst met an up-and-coming actress named Marion Davies. Actually, she was already fairly well known on Broadway. She was born in Brooklyn in 1897. Her real name was Marion Duras. Her sister inspired her to pursue an acting career, but this only came after she graduated from school and worked as a model. So basically, like Dear Evelyn from last week.
Sounds like Evelyn. Did they know each other? Nope, different city.
Yeah,
nope, same city.
Same city.
Well, Evelyn was somewhere else and they came to New York.
Yeah, they would actually probably no. She was born in 1897, so this was after, because Evelyn was breaking into modeling and acting around 1900.
Yeah, because White was murdered in 1906. So yeah, you're right.
So Marion worked her way up and was actually starring in the Ziegfeld Follies when she met William Hearst. But around this same time, she'd also get involved in movies. So she quickly proved herself a gifted comedian, which was important given that movies were still silent at this time.
Oh.
She became the most advertised actress in the world, and over the following 10 years, she would star in 29 films.
Huh.
She and Hearst would fall into an affair that would last for many decades.
Many decades.
Yeah.
Longer than one would think.
Right. In 1919, Phoebe Hearst died and left William millions of dollars, which he promptly began spending like there was no tomorrow. He set his family and his mistress up in lavish homes, but it was his creation of a palatial estate, San Simeon, in California, that would break the bank. And when it came time to choose an architect, he decided on Julia Morgan, who was the first female architect to be licensed in the state of California.
Yes.
When we decided to do this, I kind of looked her up to see if she had any scandals. And
no.
She was pretty boring.
She was very boring.
But
she never married.
Yeah.
No children, kept to herself.
Right.
Quiet.
But I think it would be considered somewhat scandalous to be an architect, female architect at this time period. So
right.
Once again, not
and
necessarily
to not marry and to not
have kids, right? So it's kind of the same idea with William Randolph Hearst. Not necessarily scandalous doings, but just created scandal by being who they were. Adrienne, you want to tell us a little bit about Julia?
I would love to. So, female architects, how many can you name? And did you know who Julia Morgan was before this?
I did, actually.
Okay.
But that's because I'm an architectural historian.
Right.
Didn't know a lot about her. I just knew that she did San Simeon, and I just always, that immediately, I think when I read that several years ago, immediately jumped out to me just because I'm always interested in women's history.
But besides her, how many others do you know? Whether historically or currently.
Yeah, not many. I'm thinking of like one, is it something Hadid?
Yeah, Zaha Hadid.
Yeah, Zaha
passed
Hadid.
away recently.
Yeah.
So that's the one that I thought about. I was familiar with Julia Morgan, but besides her, it's really Ray Eames, Zaha Hadid, and Mary Coulter, who did a few buildings at the Grand Canyon. She did the Watchtower and something else. And I had to look her up because I didn't remember her name. I knew it was a female architect that did those structures. But yeah, I sadly couldn't come up with many, whether historically or
I never thought
currently.
About it, but you were completely correct.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to joke that architecture was obviously created by men, given some of the terminology, but you're right. I mean,
yeah. So I really, it's, she's a pretty interesting, talented lady. And, just not the first woman that came to mind, but, so not only did she work on the Hearst Castle for over 20 years, so she was in Hearst's employ for that long, and they actually got along really well. There's correspondence, and, she maintained a practice in San Francisco, which is 400 miles away, the whole time she was working on the Hearst Castle.
Okay, wow.
And I think it's important to talk a little bit about what she looks like, because it's surprising. So as someone who, I guess I would think, one would maybe think that someone who could maintain this crazy work ethic, traveling back and forth between this job that took 2 decades and their own practice would be like a very, big personality and, strong person, physically strong. But Julia was only 5 feet tall and 100 pounds. So she's this wee architect.
No joke.
And obviously a total badass, even though she's petite, small but mighty.
Right.
So she did, while she was working on the Hearst Castle, she did CA, which for those uninitiated is construction administration. So she would show up to the Hearst Castle and do construction admin in tailored suits and silk blouses. So this incredible mansion at the top of a hill that's not easy to get to, and she travels to get there, and she would still show up, and there are pictures of her in just these beautiful outfits. So props to fashion.
I want to go out and buy myself suits and silk blouses.
Well, I've climbed scaffolding in heels before, so it can be done. But yeah, Julia was great. She was born in San Francisco in 1872, so she and WR had that in common. She was also very inspired by her native California, and the inspiration she drew from the state and also historical precedent that she drew from her education was the key to how she designed. She took cues from historic styles without being beholden to them. Her talent came from being able to balance historic vocabulary learned at the École des Beaux-Arts with client and site demands.
She was also one of the first females.
She was the first to be admitted into the École in 1902. Yeah, 1902. And I'd like to think that her, I guess, kind of eclecticism came from being a West Coaster influenced by popular movements at the time that made it out there and stuff that she would have learned about in Europe, like the arts and crafts movement and William Morris, but also having an awareness of engineering principles and classical training. So there wasn't truly an architecture degree then, or you may correct me on that, but I do know that if you were an architect, you often had a strong background in engineering, because it was usually that kind of went hand in hand, like architectural engineering. Right. It wasn't just architecture.
Yeah, I see that a lot when I'm researching architects at work.
They were engineers first.
Yeah, they were
or at
all
least had
engineers.
That a lot more than an architect would now.
And your alma mater, Clemson, that turned out actually a good majority of South Carolina's architects. Yeah. That they were all engineers.
Right. So the arts and crafts movement emphasis that it put on using local materials, having a strong relationship to the site, and minimal and honest detailing really resonated with Julia. So she prioritized the needs and desires of her clients. She took pleasure in creating thoughtful details and design from the inside out. Basic elements like windows, walls, stairways, and fireplaces were carefully considered, and she often drew them at full scale to fully communicate her design intent. She was also quite adept at beautiful swimming pools, which we'll talk about later, whose designs went against her own modesty. I don't think she was rigid, but you wouldn't think by looking at her. She looked kind of like a librarian, little glasses, and had her hair sort of swept up and very, buttoned down, that she would make these exotic, beautiful, colorful, light-filled swimming pools. And she was so good at knowing how to use natural light and color to emphasize the best features of a house. So like I mentioned, she was schooled at the École des Beaux-Arts. She was the first woman ever admitted. And she arrived in Paris in 1898. And in 1902, she was granted a certificate. Now, she took more than one try to pass, but it was more because the jury did not want her to be admitted than the fact that she fell short, because she really didn't. The first time, I think she was 42nd out of however many hundred, and they would only take the top 30 or 35, but it was kind of, it was questionable that she